Hey all, hope all's well. It's another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my round 3 game from the Reykjavik Open. Now, if you followed the round 2 video, you know that I lost a tough one to Grandmaster Sergey Movsesian, who's really a world-class player rated above 2600, and just a tough opponent. I had my chances with white, but I made a few oversights even after getting a position I wanted, and I went down. Now, in this one, I was playing down because when you play in an open tournament, after you lose a game, you wind up having to win 2 games just to get back up to someone around your level. Rating-wise. So it was expected that I was going to play down and I was going to be black, which is an additional challenge because, when you're playing down, sometimes the player that's playing down is happy with the draw, so they might not try to push the envelope as much as they would against a normal type of player, a player that's closer to them in strength. So I knew to expect a really, really tough game, and I really don't take playing down for granted because every opponent is really tough, and frankly, I mean, everyone's started somewhere and was at that level before. So I can recall when I was a 2100 rated player, and I managed to beat the highest rated player I've ever beaten in my life, a 2680 player. So I really truly believe anything is possible, and I know it is because I've seen it. So I was not taking my opponent lightly. My opponent in this one was an untitled player named Hector Giacomini from France. And I noticed, because you can look up players, of course, that he was actually a bit on the older side, definitely in his 50s or 60s. But that actually made me even more concerned because if you're a bit of an older player and you have a wealth of experience, that could really serve you well. I think sometimes when you play down and you're playing really young players, they're going to have the typical drawbacks, the typical problems, but sometimes old players will have, they might not be sharp all the time, but they're certainly going to be sharp most of the game, and they have usually good foundation because they've been playing for a while. Anyways, let's get into it. So before I do get into it, I'm just going to preface, this was an extremely long game. So buckle your seatbelts, do what you got to do, get a cup of water, whatever drink of choice, maybe it's a beer, because this one was a long one. So I'm probably not going to go over every single move like I try to do with most of my games because this was so long, but it's a marathon. So, just buckle up. All right, so my opponent played knight f3, and knight f3 is a very flexible move. You don't know if they're going to go for an English or they're just going to go d4 or maybe even a fianchetto setup. So very, very flexible move. I went d5, and then e3 was played, and e3 is extremely modest. And already here I kind of got the picture that my opponent, Hector, was not going to push the envelope too greatly. He was kind of just going to play, fairly normally and see where that gets him. And, it was funny because I've played these type of systems before. If you've seen any of my games in the series, you know that I played knight f3, d4, e3 for a few months. So it was kind of funny that he was trotting out this stuff. I went knight f6, and then d4 was played, and I went e6, which I normally do, but you can see here that the system is already symmetrical. The board is completely symmetrical, and that symmetry is not exactly something I'm going to want to have for an extended period of time, particularly if I want to try to win the game. So already here I was thinking about ways in which I may be able to break the symmetry. White went bishop d3. I went b6. b6 was a move that was actually used against me when I played these systems. In particular, Brandon Jacobson used it against me to win a very nice game or actually he did not win that game. He should have won that game, but he drew that game against me in the first round of the Marshall GMIM Invitational, which is a game covered in the series where I got an awful position. So I think this is the remedy to deal with knight f3, e3, bishop d3. So just go for early b6. White castled, and I went bishop b7. And my point is that if white goes for c4, I was probably going to go d takes c4 and balance it that way. And then the argument is with the pawn on c4, well, and after taking, this bishop on this diagonal is kind of biting on granite with my pawns on e6 and f7, and it kind of lost the tempo, if you will, in terms of getting to c4, because it took 2 moves. It went to d3, and then it went to c4 to get to c4. So that was what I was thinking about. White went b3, which I think makes a lot of sense, because now if he tries to play c4, he can recapture with the b pawn and maintain a nice pawn center. On the flip side, it also just keeps the position relatively symmetrical. So you could see I've already fianchettoed my bishop on the queen side. He might consider doing the same. And again, this is not something I'm going to want to deal with for a long period of time. Because of this, I wound up playing bishop e7. And this was my little nuance, my wrinkle to kind of break the symmetry. My argument is that my bishop on e7 is actually better placed than the one on d3 because my queen is a little bit more ready for the center to open up. One of the drawbacks of having this bishop on d3 in these systems is that if the center does open up, the bishop on d3 might be a little bit awkward because it breaks the connection of the queen from the pawn on the d4. And so I was thinking that me having this set up like this would be a nice thing. The flip side of it is there are some dynamics where if d pawns are traded in some way, shape, or form, it may be nice to have the bishop on this diagonal like this. And in many respects, if the bishop was on e2, bishop takes f3 would never be a move. In many respects, that's not usually a move, but let's just say the queen winds up having to go away from this diagonal. I might consider unbalancing the position with bishop takes f3 at some point. And clearly, if the bishop was on e2, I wouldn't even consider that dynamic because it wouldn't compromise white's pawn structure, and he would just have the 2 bishops for nothing. So that was another thing that imbalances the position. So kind of if you just sum it up and, take all these things if you take all of them into consideration, you get the sense that the bishop on e7 is more of a defensive piece, the bishop on d3 is more of an aggressive piece, and I was banking on my bishop on e7 being kind of like a more long-term play where the bishop on d3 is kind of a short-term play. All right, so bishop e2 was played, copying me, and you see the only difference is the position of our king's bishop, so keep that in mind. I castled, and now white went knight bd2, and it's still completely symmetrical, almost completely, which kind of breaks my heart, but I thought I'd have to live with this for a little bit. Instead of copying with knight bd7, though, went for c5. And my point with c5 was that now that this knight is on d2, it's not actually the most active square. The most active square would be c3. And now that white has not committed to playing c4, I thought it was my responsibility to strike in the middle first. And I must say, if d takes c5 was played, I would have had a decision to make. But I think I probably would have played b takes c5 if I wanted to play for the win, to keep these pawns in the center. And there's a risk of me having hanging pawns here because white can go to c4 and play against my hanging pawn structure. But I think it's a reasonable way to play dynamically, particularly if I want to win. And I certainly did. So I thought this was the way I was probably going to go. Instead, white went for c4, copying me. And now you can see the position is, there's this tension in the center with the d4, c5 pawns and the c4, d5 pawns. But I think it was of huge benefit to me that now I get to decide what the pawn tension or the pawn structure is going to look like and how the pawn tension is going to be resolved. Because he's basically passing to me saying, well, do you want to play hanging pawns? Do you want to liquidate everything? And I thought from a positional perspective, I'd be quite happy to play the hanging pawns position or play against the hanging pawns position because it would be, in the long term, in my benefit to have fewer pawn islands. So what I did was I first went knight c6, asking him if he wanted to resolve the tension. And he said no. He played rook c1. And another difference here arises where you see the knight on c6 is on a more active post than the knight on d2. So you can see there are these differences now between the knight on c6, knight on d2, and the bishop on e7 and the bishop on d3. And I think these differences are in my favor. But now I decide to make another final resolution to kind of, stack up the differences in the position, the imbalances, and it is resolving the tension. And so with c takes d4 and e takes d4, we have a structure now where there are hanging pawns on c4 and d4, and potentially I can play against the Isolani on d4 in the long run, or against the c4 pawn. So I was kind of happy to get this slight imbalance, even though in the short term, white might have some initiative on the king side, because having a little bit more space in the center with all the minor pieces on the board means that white is going to try to train all these pieces into some type of initiative on my king. Or at least that's usually what it comes out to being. So I had to think fast about how I want to deal with this type of play. And one thing I was already thinking about was white thinking about playing knight e5. Because if the knight comes to e5, I'm not sure if I'd want to play knight takes e5. I wasn't totally sure, because after d takes e5, maybe knight d7, this queen could come over here and maybe create some threats. So I wasn't totally sure about that. And I also wasn't totally sure if white just keeps the tension and goes queen e2 and rook e1 and kind of waits on me to do something, what my plan was going to be. Because I can take on c4 when I want, but I want to time it in a really good way. Now, if you think about chess fundamentals, and I think about them ad nauseum, one of the things I was really keen on was connecting my rooks. And the problem in this position, in particular with the bishop on e7, is actually robs my queen of the square that it would naturally want to go to. So the queen really would love to be on e7 because it's out of the line of fire of the d file and the c file, which are usually the files on which rooks tend to stand in queen pawn openings. And note, if I go queen c7, I'm kind of walking into an unpleasant pin. So I was thinking, how do I get my queen out of the way of the 8th rank and enable myself to connect my rooks without it being in harm's way? And I landed on the move queen b8. Queen b8 is a very, very unique and I would dare say elegant move. I was very happy to find this. And the point of it is that I'm eyeing important dark squares, and in particular the f4 square. This f4 square is extremely sensitive, and I thought if my queen lands there, I connect my rooks, and I manage to shift my queen towards the king side in a really nice way. Now, the way that white would, basically stop this f4 queen f4 move, the only way would be to play a move like g3. And I thought g3 was a very, very double-edged move and not one you necessarily want to make, in particular when you understand that black can open up the light square diagonal whenever he wants by going d takes c4. So I thought g3 would be one that you might be a little bit reluctant to make. On the flip side, you can consider playing knight e5, but I thought that now I could play knight takes e5, d takes e5, knight d7, and I'm already attacking this pawn, which kind of slows down any initiative on the queen side or on the king side that white might consider. For instance, if queen h5, I can just stymie that with g6, and you can see after the queen moves, the e5 pawn will be hanging. On the flip side, knight f3 can be played defending the e5 pawn, but now the queen can't really get to the king side effectively, and I can even play knight c5, hitting this bishop with tempo, and let's say the bishop moves back to like b1. I think I'm already in a quite advantageous position here, but a move like rook d8 now I think would be really nice. Basically, putting the rook on the same file as the queen. Again, my bishop is ready to be unleashed if d takes c4 comes whenever I feel like. And I just thought long-term my prospects are quite good, especially because both my bishops have mobility, whereas this bishop on b2 is really biting on its own pawn, on granite on e5. So I thought that black would be better there. And another thing to point out is if a move like queen c2 is played trying to just checkmate me, I can always stick this knight on e4 and just say no to that. So I thought this was all pretty reasonable play for me, and that's why I got so excited when I saw queen b8. So white decided to play queen e2, kind of acknowledging that the ways to block my queen from going to that square weren't particularly ideal. But now this just allows me to execute my maneuver, and I was very happy to get in queen f4. And you can see this queen was on d8 a few moves ago, and now it's on a way better square, and my rooks are connected. So if I'm allowed, I just go rook d8, rook c8, and sort of decide when to open up with d takes c4 whenever I feel like. So I thought this would be good. Here, white decided to play queen e3, and this was a move I hadn't really strongly considered. I saw it was an option, but I was quite surprised when it actually appeared on the board. And I think the reason I was surprised is because it didn't seem to be in the spirit of the position. Normally, again, when you're playing these hanging pawns, you're trying to get an initiative on my king, an attack on my king. And it's hard to imagine with the queens off the board that you can do that. On the flip side, if you allowed my queen to stay here, maybe I would have gotten some initiative off. So I understand why he maybe thought the queen f4 couldn't be tolerated. Again, if you aim for a move like g3, the diagonal gets opened up here, which is unpleasant. And now my queen has this very nice square on h6, and it's quite secure there, believe it or not. It can consider going to h3, and it's just a very reasonable square for the queen. I mean, the only way it could truly be harassed would be like a rook move and then bishop c1, but that just takes a little bit too much time. So I thought that, I was pretty much in good shape here. But after queen e3, I had to decide, do I want to trade queens or not? And I certainly didn't want to go back, so the only way to avoid trading queens would have been queen g4. And I kind of reasoned here that after h3 and queen h5, I'm not so sure, what this got me here with my queen h5, and I helped him create an escape square for his own king with h3, and it's just unclear how to follow up. So I thought it would be better to trade queens, and that's what I did with queen takes e3. But after f takes e3, the character of the position completely changes, because what you have now is a scenario where I was talking about playing against the hanging pawns, and now this d4 pawn is really well protected by the pawn on e3. There's no real way to get at that d4 pawn. So in essence, I thought that this e3 pawn might be a little bit of a weakness, but it's actually quite easy to defend with a move like king f2. And so I really don't have a lot of pressure on d4. Now, the one thing that I do have going for me is this potential pawn tension. This is positive pawn tension on c4. But on the flip side, it's kind of clear that it's really well protected by white. So all in all, queen e3 was a very interesting and dynamic move. And, well, I thought that, I might have some play here, but I actually think the position's close to equal. So now that the d4 pawn is kind of firmly secure, I thought I need to kind of consider playing on the c file. That's where my counterplay was going to be now. So I tried to move quickly to make that happen. I first played d takes c4. You might say, well, didn't you just talk about pawn tension and having that tension? Well, the thing that I was thinking about is that if he decides not to take back with the pawn, I thought if like knight takes c4, I thought my bishop would have a nice diagonal, and maybe now having 3 pawn islands, I might be able to play in this against the center by playing a move like knight b4, hitting this bishop, and maybe playing on the e3 pawn. Maybe it was a little bit rushed, but I thought this was a way to go. B takes c4 was played, and so, I still have the hanging pawns, and I decide to rush to get counterplay against it with rook a c8. And now my plan over the next few moves is essentially to hammer away at the c4 pawn the best I can. So rook c8, h3 was played. I don't like this move h3. I understand why it was played. I think maybe he was worried about knight g4, but I think it's a little bit too slow. I think instead he could have considered, building up on the c file or, just getting some other plan going. Because after h3, I go rook c7, and now you can see I'm going to try and double on the c file and just continue to get pressure on c4. a3 is played. Again, this move makes some sense because it covers me from playing knight b4, but on the flip side, it's a little bit slow. These h3 and a3 moves kind of tell me that white was a little bit uncertain about how to play this pawn structure and was kind of maybe saying, show me what you're going to do. The other reason I don't like a3 is that it makes the pawn an actual target. So there are some scenarios now where the bishop might be tied to the a3 pawn, whereas before it wasn't. So I think a3 is a little bit weakening. Also, you do weaken the b3 square, and I was considering already playing knight a5 to target this pawn even more, and having the b3 square as an option maybe later in the game, maybe isn't ideal for white. So after a3, I went bishop a6. Another point was to skewer on this diagonal, just again freezing the c-pawn in place. Before I put my rook on c8, I want to also make sure that the c-pawn isn't pushed in any way. Rook c2 makes sense, trying to protect the c4 pawn, overprotect it. And now rook fc8, rook fc1, and knight a5. And you can see in the span of a few moves, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 attackers on the c4 pawn, and it's actually pinned. So I've done well to get this far and put all this pressure on. Now, the funny thing is white has 1, 2, 3, 4 defenders, so it's still actually not hanging, and I need to add more fuel to the fire. But I was happy with my position now because at least I have a target on c4 and a potential target on a3. And it's already kind of hard for white to move some of his queenside pieces, right? Like the d2 knight can't move because the c4 pawn is hanging. The bishop has to stay on this diagonal. The rook can't move from c1. This one only has 1 square. This bishop on b2 can't move because a3 is hanging. So pretty much all of these pieces are stymied, and I thought, I'm getting somewhere here. Another thing I was thinking about in some positions was actually playing knight d5. The point being to attack e3 and suggest that c takes d5 doesn't work because bishop takes d3. But the problem with it that doesn't work is if knight d5, sorry, my arrows, after knight d5, c takes d5, if I take on d3, my rook on c7 is hanging. So the tactic actually doesn't quite work, but it was something I was thinking about. And just in general, taking advantage of the c4 pawn being pinned would give me certain possibilities. So white played king f2 now, and this was a move I think should have been played much earlier because you can bring the king to e2 and protect the bishop on d3. And in general, again, this knight g4 was not such a big threat if the king got to f2 quite quickly. So that's why I think h3 wasn't necessarily the best move early on. I now went knight e8, trying to add even more fuel to the fire. And the point is now if I add a 5th piece to the c4 pawn, well, it's kind of hard to defend. So I thought, now if I get this knight to d6, I'm really getting somewhere with all my other minor pieces. And the knight on e5 in particular would not be very secure because I could kick it away with f6. So anyways, king e2 was played. And now I went for f6 first. Very, very important move. You might say, why didn't you go knight d6 right away? Well, the reason I didn't go knight d6 right away is because it invites c5, and all of a sudden the knight on d6 is hanging and the bishop on a6 is hanging, and I wasn't too sure this would be, favorable because after bishop takes d3, maybe he's able to play on here because my knight is hanging and I'm not able to corral the c-pawn. So I thought it was a little bit better to just have a little bit of patience before I played knight d6, and also to cover him from playing knight e5. Because another thing I was thinking about is if I go knight d6 and then knight e5 first instead of c5, and now f6, c5 might be even better here. Point being is that after bishop takes d3 check, he can take with the knight, and now the knight is covering c5. So if b takes c5, he can take like this, and now he preserves his pawns in the middle. So a very key difference here with the knight coming like this. Also eyeing e6. Again, not yet because there's a pin here, but I just thought it'd be important to take away the f6 square or the e5 square from the knight on f3. And in some positions, I actually limit the bishop's scope on this diagonal by, prophylactically shutting it down. So all right, so f6. So f6. And now e4 was played. And e4, I think, is way, way, way too aggressive and just ill-advised. I think the timing is poor and it's not justified because now I get in knight d6 and now I have 5 pieces on that pawn, and you can't really defend it again, right? Because knight e5 is not possible, and none of these pieces can really move to solve anything. So really the only way to deal with this is to go for c5. And this I calculated would win me a pawn. I went bishop takes d3 check first, king takes, b takes c5, very important, and after d takes c5, I went knight db7. And the funny thing about this is now there are only 2 defenders on the c5 pawn, and after this move knight b7, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 attackers. So there's really no way you can cover this pawn effectively, and it's going to be won. So the first kind of phase of the battle is over. I've managed to win a pawn and under reasonable circumstances, and the question is it enough to win, and can I convert? c6 was played. I think that's a good move, a good intermediate move, just making sure my knight doesn't come to c5 with check, capturing that pawn with check. And the other reason I think it's good is because it asks me an important question. And that question is, do I want to trade all the rooks? If I take the pawn with my rook, he could potentially trade like this and go to this type of endgame. And the question is this winning? Can he get counterplay here? I wasn't so sure. I thought that, a move like king c4 concerned me. Maybe the king can get active coming to b5. And I do recognize I have this a6 move potentially stopping the king from crossing the plane for now. But I was not sure whether or not this would be truly winning or the easiest conversion. And because of it, I actually thought it'd be smarter to keep a pair of rooks on the board. So what I did was after rook takes c6, rook takes, I actually went knight takes c6, voluntarily pinning myself because I thought it would be a little bit smarter to keep a rook on the board just because the d file was open and the b file was open, and I could potentially get some counterplay on one of those files. So I thought this was a little bit better way to play, but I'm still not sure. Maybe it's something you can heavily analyze or wonder or think about because it was an important question for me. Anyways, white went knight b3 now, activating the knight on d2, and also just saying, hey, you're still pinned, you have to resolve this pin, and not helping me do it easily because my next move, if he didn't go knight b3, was to go knight c5 check and then just move my rook. So knight b3 is a good move because it stops that. So I went king f7 now, not quite breaking the pin, but just getting my king close to the action, protecting e6, because I thought I have rook d8 when I feel like it. White now went g4, pressing onward on the king side, and I think it's a reasonable move to, when you're material down, you don't want to necessarily trade everything, but I think it is important that white tries to stay as active as possible, being down material, because if he kind of just crawls around on the last few ranks, he's going to get squeezed. I'm going to take more space and kind of squeeze him, and so I think he was kind of doing a good thing here, trying to remain active. I now went knight b d8, which is a very, very awkward move to make to protect this knight. But the thought process was I just want to play rook b8 and, unpin my rook. And the other way that I was thinking of all along with rook d8 check didn't really satisfy me because I thought after king e2, this knight still is hanging and it's not so easy to defend. I mean, the d8 square for one would be taken away. The e7 square is not available. E5 is not available. D4 isn't available. B4 isn't available. And also, I didn't love this rook getting active, maybe coming to c7. So I thought, you know what? I really should keep my knight on this outpost because it stops the rook from infiltrating. So I went knight db8 or knight bd8. And now white went knight bd4. And this is kind of annoying. He's still keeping this pin on. It's very frustrating, but it is what it is. I went e5 now, challenging this knight, saying, hey, relieve this pin for me, relieve the tension. And after knight takes e6, I still took with the knight because, again, I was not entirely confident about the endings with the rooks off the board. So I thought it would be nice to have this extra dynamic of the rook to just bother this king that's a little bit exposed. Now, the flip side of it is in the last move, I just played e5. And e5 is kind of double-edged because it puts the pawn on a dark square, which could be a potential target later in the game. And it also means that some of these light squares are a little bit sensitive. But my rationale was that it was more valuable at this juncture to shut out this knight and this bishop from actually using the d4 square. So I thought that even though my pawns were set up on dark squares, it made sense to restrict his minor pieces. So kind of a double-edged decision, but I thought it made sense. White now went rook c4, keeping the pin on and trying to maybe get a little bit more active. I think that's a reasonable move. And here I played king e6, but it's not the best move. I thought here that I needed to get my king as quickly as possible to the queen side to protect the knight so that my rook was finally mobile again. But it turns out a much, much stronger move would have been rook b8. And the reason for that is I get out of the pin and I just challenge the bishop on b2. And if you've watched any videos on this channel, I've spoken ad nauseum about the concept of bishops being better than knights. And in this case, it's actually true because if rook takes c6, rook takes b2, this bishop, it was guarding the this is a rook here, but the bishop was guarding the pawn on a3. And after rook b3 check, I'm going to pick up this a3 pawn, or maybe even rook a2, because it's already attacked once. So the point is that he couldn't really tolerate the trading the knight for the bishop. And after a move like bishop c3, now I can go knight d8, and my knight can go to e6 and maybe f4 or c5, where where it'd be on an active outpost and wreak havoc. So that would have been a much, much more effective way, but I just missed it. After king e6, white went h4. Again, this concept of taking more space and making it difficult for me to use my majority, I think, was a good decision. I went king d7, continuing with my plan. And now white went h5. And white has a lot of space on the king side for being a pawn down. And it's very annoying and very, very good decision-making by Hector here, because, again, if you lay down passively, I will just squeeze you. Now he's taking more space, making it difficult for me to push my pawns, and securing a potential outpost in the future for this f5 knight, or f3 knight. So maybe if it gets knight h4, f5, that's a way for it to get in the game now that d4 is taken away. I went rook b8, finally, but you can see I could have played that a few moves ago. And now king c2. And now I went knight d8. Again, kind of shifting my knight towards e6, which was the plan. But you could see here that I'm like several moves behind on something I could have executed a while back. And in the meantime, white has certainly improved his position in terms of the space here and just the initiative, or not the initiative, but the controlling the king side here. I haven't managed to invade yet. White went knight h4, trying to get at f5, and the thing is now this pawn's in h5, I can't even stop it, because again, g6 would just hang a pawn. So you could see how, White has done pretty well to try and stay and fight in this game, and very, very impressive by Hector, who's again is 2100 FIDE. So after knight h4, I went knight e6, just continuing with my own plan. And the other thing with the knight on e6 is it actually protects g7, which is a nice finesse. But now this knight comes to f5, which is extremely annoying because this is something I constantly have to worry about. And now even knight takes e7 is an idea. And I was thinking, as active as this knight is, I'm not really sure I want to give it up for this bishop on e7. I really was not sure. So I wound up playing bishop f8. To just say, you know what, this bishop, even though it's not super active now, is better than this knight, in particular because it eyes the pawn on a3. So white went knight e3, now seeing that my g7 pawn was firmly protected, eyeing another outpost on d5. And you could just see how white is just being a little annoying and on every move, a little bit nagging, making it more and more difficult to convert. I went knight f4, trying to stop this knight from going to d5, and again, securing this outpost. And this is something I wanted all along, but it would have been nice to have this earlier. Bishop c1 was played. I think that's a reasonable move as well. Just getting this bishop out of the line of fire of the rook, freeing up the king, and maybe potentially one day challenging my knight on f4. Who knows? I went g6 now because I thought that this was now a better time as any to try and break up this pawn mass on the king side that was bothering me. And in some positions, maybe giving my rook another file to work with on h8, because as long as white is managing to control my entry squares on the queen side, it's pretty clear that my rook is going to need to find some type of activity. So I thought g6 would one day open the h file for me. So after h takes g6 and h takes, now I have this one for the future. The flip side of it, though, is that I traded another pawn, and you could see that with every pawn that's traded, white might feel a little bit closer to the draw because, things just tend to reduce. I mean, rook endgames, a pawn down, in many instances can be held. So this was something that I think Hector was thinking about. And quite frankly, when you play older players, they tend to have better endgame skills than the younger players, so they're keenly aware of some of these drawing mechanisms. All right, so bishop b2 was played, a little bit passive, a little bit of a waiting move. I'm not sure why that was the move that was played. Maybe he was thinking about me playing knight e2 and knight d4 and didn't want to allow my knight to that outpost. It doesn't really change much. and I went bishop d6, reinforcing my e5 pawn. And here, actually, I realized what bishop b2 actually did, because I didn't quite realize initially. And the point was that after rook a4, first hitting my a7 pawn, and bishop c5, which I wound up playing, that this bishop now might be able to undermine my e5 pawn with a g5 break. So it was very, very frustrating when I realized that. And it doesn't quite work right away, because if g5 now, the knight is hanging. But I started to realize that this g5 move might be something I have to worry about with the bishop on this diagonal, just undermining my pawns. So after bishop c5, knight c4 was played, just protecting that knight. And I have a decision to make, because the question is, do I want to allow g5? Do I not? But I thought g5 is a little bit risky, because it means that all my pawns are in dark squares. The thing is that then the pawns would be fixed on the light squares. White's pawns would be. And I thought maybe they'd be harder to get at. But I don't know. They're also isolated and weak. So it's kind of this double-edged decision I have to make, whether I want to go g5 or not. I wound up going knight e6, which I thought was another way to stop black from white. Well, excuse me, another way to stop white from pushing g5. But again, this move deserves serious consideration. Just keeping my knight on this outpost, fixing these pawns, and then shifting gears with rook h8. It maybe would have been more tenacious. After knight c4, knight e6, white went rook a6, and this was a move, quite frankly, I missed, because I didn't fully appreciate that on a6, he's still eyeing a7, and he's freezing my knight on e6, because now I have to worry about this f6 pawn. And the flip side is now g5 is actually a real threat, because after g5, if I take with a knight, he takes on f6, and if I take with a pawn, he takes on e5 with check. So rook a6 was a really strong move, and I just underestimated its power. I went bishop b6 because I thought the threat of g5 was so strong that I couldn't allow this rook to run havoc on my remaining pawns. But this was not a move I wanted to make, because I'm forfeiting my lovely bishop for this knight, which is not what you want to do. So after knight takes b6, a takes b6, we now have a scenario where I am a pawn up, but this knight is not incredible, and he might be able to sort of undermine my pawns, and he did that immediately with rook a7 check, now trying to get behind here. And I realized that, my winning chances for the most part seem to be going right down the drain. I went king d6, stepping up. I thought it was better than going to the 8th rank. And after bishop c3, he's even managing to threaten bishop b4 check. I thought rook f7 right away was going to be his idea. But if he went rook f7 right away, I could at least consider rook f8. Here, after bishop c3, he's threatening check, and then he can even go rook e7 and challenge my knight, or go rook f7 afterward, because my rook wouldn't have the f8 square anymore, because the bishop would be covering it. So really, really interesting turn of events. I went rook h8 trying to get active, because I thought now that it seemed that I wasn't going to be able to hold all my pawns together, I should at least try and get some counterplay from behind and kind of distract. It actually turns out that a better move would have been knight g5, because from g5 I actually attack e4 and I prevent rook f7 at the same time, attacking and defending, as they say. Although the game would have continued after king d3 and rook h8, and the game goes on for sure. It's not by any means a done deal, but you can see here I'm threatening rook h3, my knight is eyeing e4, maybe a better winning attempt. After rook h8, bishop b4 check, and king c6, now rook f7 was played, and you can see my pawn is just completely hanging, and I can't even defend it. So huge turn of events, and very disappointing for me. I went knight d4 check, just realizing that I was going to have to jettison this pawn on f6, and thinking now it's just time to try and be active and go for some swindles. I noticed that the king was a little bit airy if it stepped up here, so I thought that I might get rook h3 check, and there's some ways I could harass. For instance, if king c3, rook h3 check, king c4, b5 would be mate. So just one example of a little bit of a swindle. So at least I thought the king would have to go backward, and I might have some counterplay with the king is on the back rank. So that was now where my focus shifted from holding my material to trying to, attack with the limited material I have. So after knight d4 check, white went king d1, which is very alert. And I thought about playing rook h1 check, but I didn't think that would solve anything, because after king d2, rook h2, king d1, and rook f2, I wind up defending my pawn, but now white can go bishop e7, and more things wind up getting liquidated here. I mean, I can push f5, but you could see, again, we have more trades, and I don't know, I didn't really believe in this one. Although I could certainly fight. I could try and confuse pushing the e-pawn. I just didn't believe in it. So instead I thought, okay, let me try and go for some checkmating idea, getting my king in on the light squares. So I went for it. I went king b5 here instead of rook h1. And after rook takes f6, I went king c4, trying to scare my opponent in his time trouble with my super active king and my knight on this outpost. But he was not afraid, and he did not buckle. First, he went king e1. I think that's a great move, just avoiding the opposition that I was trying to get with king d3. I think that makes a lot of sense. And you can see my pawns are still hanging. I went b5 now, covering one of them. And now after bishop d6, it seems like all my pawns are kind of hanging, but I was kind of just ignoring them. I went rook h2, trying to get something going again on the back rank. And bishop takes e5 was played. And then I went knight c2 check, king d1, knight e3, king c1, rook c2, king b1, and rook g2. And again, I had some kind of nebulous threats. My idea was that if rook takes g6, I can go king b3 and threaten this back rank mate. And note that I don't think king c1 solves anything, because I have rook g1 check, and after king d2, knight c4, and I fork the king and the bishop. And I think this position would be winning. I think. I'm not 100% sure, actually, because there is rook g5 at the end. For instance, if king e2, knight takes, there is rook g5, and now this knight and pawn are in the line of fire. So maybe I need to switch up that move order a little bit. Maybe instead of playing rook g1 first, I can start with knight c4, and maybe I can threaten checkmate and attack this bishop. Although I am seeing that bishop d4 is the move now. So very, very tough, very tough. Although even here, maybe rook c4 now is the move, because the king can't go to d1, because I have rook d2 check. And if it goes to b1, now I have rook d2, and I'm threatening rook d1 mate and the bishop on d4, and there's really no way to avoid both of those threats at the same time. So I think this position would be winning, but again, these types of threats he was not going to allow this opposition, so he was very alert, and after rook g2, he went rook f3, challenging my knight before my king could wind up getting to b3. Good move. I went rook e2, trying to, shield this rook off just long enough for my king to get to b3 anyway. But now white played bishop b2, and the nice thing about bishop b2 is he also has bishop c1 at his disposal to challenge this knight, and he kind of blocks off the second rank for now. I went rook e1, king a2, rook e2, king b1. First offer of a repetition that I would decline. And I went knight d1. And the next phase of the game, I'm just going to say for many, many moves, the position is completely equal. At any juncture, I could, recapture one of these pawns, but I would lose the coordination of my pieces and the phantom threats I'm creating on white's king. And I didn't want to lose that. So I was basically playing on my opponent's time and trying to create threats, because I knew that I could probably draw the game whenever I wanted, even if I was a pawn down. So just keep that in mind when you see the next few moves and you're like, well, why doesn't he recapture this pawn, or what's he going for? I'm going for tricks. So knight d1 is the first trick, just targeting b2. Bishop a1, rook takes e4. I do recapture one pawn just so it doesn't run. And after g5, I go rook e1. Well, another kind of, nasty, nebulous threat. The threat is knight c3, or even knight e3 discover check, and sometimes targeting the a1 bishop. All right, so king a2 gets out of that. Rook e2, king b1, and knight e3 back. The annoying thing about this bishop on a1 is actually controls a lot of the squares that my knight would love to check the king on. So it actually turns out that even though this bishop is super passive here, it's actually not so bad. Bishop b2 was played, again, maybe trying for bishop c1. And now knight d5, again, just prophylactically dealing with that threat. Also stopping a potential rook f6, trying to corral my g6 pawn. Bishop f6 now, reasonable move, just protecting this pawn. And now rook g2, keeping an eye on it. King c1, king c5, king b1, king c6, king c1, king b6. And I did not have a clear plan here, but I was just kind of waiting, probing, trying to get something going. This is what you sometimes need to do when you want to win a game. It's not pretty, but you can kind of grind away best you can and see what happens. So bishop d8, king c6, bishop f6, knight b6. Now I'm trying a new outpost, thinking about going to c4. Rook c3, king d5, rook d3, king c5, king b1, and now knight c4. Okay, what has changed? Well, my knight's on c4 now. I'm looking at a3. My rook is also trained on g5, so at least his pieces are a little bit tied down. The problem is that unless my king gets active, I can't really change. I can't add any more pressure to either of these pawns. So I was trying to think about ways that could happen. So bishop e7, king c6, bishop f6, rook e2. The idea with that was actually to stop bishop e7 because I thought I might be able to try to run my king there. Rook c3, king d5, king c3, knight e3, king b1, knight c4, king c3, knight d6. All right, a new plan. Trying to get the knight to e4 to, again, challenge the pawn on g5, challenge the pawn f6, and challenge the rook on c3. So just shifting plan, shifting gears, trying to make something else work here. Rook d3, king e6, rook b3, rook e4. Note that my knight is kind of tied down to the b5 pawn for now. King c2, rook f4, rook c3, knight e4. Okay, progress. So my knight is hitting the rook, it's hitting the bishop on f6, hitting the pawn on g5, and the rook is no longer challenging the b3 pawn. So I thought, all right, I might be able to win a pawn here. Rook c6 was played, king d7, and rook b6. And now I went rook f5, and I was like, wow. It's been like almost 20, 30 moves or so of maneuvering, and I'm going to win the g5 pawn. There's no way I thought that black would not win the g5 pawn. White cannot move this bishop away on this diagonal because my king's guarding both of the squares. And once I take that pawn, I'm also protecting g6. So I thought this was a huge victory. It's the little things in positions like this. Although, even though I can win that pawn, it's still a drawn position. I mean, at the end of the day, the material is so limited that, if white manages to trade A for B and then just sacks the bishop for the pawn, rook and knight versus rook is a draw. So even then, I would try to press, but it would not be anywhere near a winning position. It would just be hoping for a blunder. So anyways, king b3, king c7, challenging that rook first before capturing on g5. Bishop d4. And the nice trick about king c7, by the way, is this rook has no other squares on the 6th rank without a fork. So if rook a6, there's knight c5. And if rook e6, there's also knight c5, winning the rook. So bishop d4 is actually the only move to actually hold the rook, believe it or not. There's no other squares that the rook has access to. It has to stay here. And that's the other thing is, you set enough traps and eventually it's hard to defend all of them. So he defended this one, but I've won a pawn now with rook. First I start with rook d5, challenging this bishop just to see how he would defend. And after bishop g1 and rook takes g5, I've managed to win a pawn, and keep the game going. Another thing I want to point out here is after rook d5, this bishop actually only has one square on the diagonal because c5 is covered, e3 is covered indirectly because rook d3 check, and f2 is covered. So the only move was bishop g1. So hey, in the last few moves, white has had to make only moves, which is always a good sign for the attacking side. So bishop g1, rook takes, bishop d4, rook d5, challenging that bishop again, bishop g1. And here's essentially the problem that I have. The problem I have is that if I push the g-pawn, all of a sudden this rook on b6 has a lot more squares. In particular, it could go to g6 or h6 and can start to check me horizontally on the 7th rank while also guarding the g-pawn from being pushed. So that was the major problem I had, is that if I push this pawn, this rook gets activated. But on the flip side, how am I going to get any more play going? Because white can consider going a4 whenever they feel like and try to just liquidate and draw the game. So, real dilemma here. I went knight d6, trying to, again, block off this rook from becoming active, because I recognized that my only hope was pushing this g-pawn, but also making sure this rook doesn't get behind it. White went rook a6, trying to, entertain maybe going invading still on a7, and I went rook d2, acknowledging that I can't really stop rook a7, but I can try and get something going elsewhere. King b4 was played. I was kind of surprised by that one because I thought it wasn't super necessary. I thought rook a7 was the better move, and now I pretty much have to block with knight b7 if I want to stop the rook from getting to g7, but now my knight is pinned, and I think, after a move like rook a8, he could just shift over here, and again, you're not going to stop me from invading, or you're not going to stop white from invading, so it would kind of just be a close to draw position. Instead, king b4 allows me a few more tricks. I go g5, pushing that pawn, and after bishop e3, I go rook d5, which protects, keeps my pawns together. And now white went bishop c5, attacking this knight on d6, but I can just continue pushing the pawn. And I thought about g4, but I thought, you know what, I'm not going to rush it. I'm going to go knight e4 first to just challenge this bishop. And then the bishop wound up moving, and now I went king d7, which is a move I didn't want to make, but I thought it's important to keep all my pieces on light squares. White went rook b6, attacking this pawn on b7. I don't love this move. I think it would have been much better and cleaner to just now go rook g6 now that I opened the door to get to the other side. Instead, after rook b6, I went knight d6 back. And now bishop c5 was played, and I recognized here, well, I can't move the knight because he just takes this pawn, and I need to just accept the reality of the position and ignore it, and I went king c7. And amazingly here, on move 100, is where my opponent made the losing move. A losing blunder, which was rook takes d6. And it's a real shame, but rook takes d6 loses on the spot and transposes to a losing pawn endgame. The point is that after rook takes, bishop takes, and king takes, he's just out of the square. This king is way too far from g1 to make it back in time. And so after king takes b5, g4, he's just out of the box. In fact, he would need to be here for it to work. If he was here and it was either side to move, he would make it. Otherwise, he's not. So after king c4, if he didn't go king c4. After king c4, g3, king d3, you could see he's not there in time. And so, unfortunately, after g4, my opponent resigned on move 102. Well, I felt bad for him because we were the last game in the playing hall. It was definitely a 6-hour affair, but in the end, he was not able to hold the position in which he was pretty much slightly worse the whole game. So I was very happy with the game. I think it's a testament to persistence. I think in many instances the game is never over if as long as you keep fighting, you keep playing to the, pretty much till bare kings. And I try to exemplify that most of the time when I get out there. And this was a much, much needed win. And there were a lot of ups and downs. You could see I won a pawn after a nice grinded out phase, but I didn't convert particularly well, and he did play very, very actively when he was a pawn down. I think that's something that any low-rate player can, kind of take from this game is when you are worse, don't kind of just, sink into a hole or, hibernate because that will make the strong player's job really easy, and you want to make it difficult. So you make it difficult by still, challenging me for squares, doing all these things that make it difficult. And in the end, I just was a few moves better than him today. All right, I know that was a marathon. If you got to the end, thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to this channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you can do so by making a donation in the PayPal link in the description below. All right, take care.